18 December 1944, 4 in the morning. A stone bridge over the Ambelve in the hills above Stavelot, Belgium. The water was running high and black under the arches, swollen with December rain, and the only light came from a farmhouse burning half a mile downstream, a fire nobody had set on purpose and nobody could spare the men to put out. 8 American soldiers lay flat along the near bank, listening to something they could not yet see. Engines. A lot of them. Somewhere past the tree line, diesel engines were idling in a column that did not end, and every few seconds the ground gave a small, private shudder that had nothing to do with the artillery 3 miles east. Sergeant Frank Dabrowski put 2 fingers against the stone parapet and felt it hum. He did not know yet what was moving toward him in the dark. He knew only that it was heavy, that it was close, and that the bridge under his hands was the only crossing for 6 miles in either direction that could carry it. Somewhere behind those engines was an answer to a question the whole Allied line would be asking within the hour. How far can Germany still reach? Dabrowski's squad had been separated from their battalion 2 days earlier in the confusion east of the river, cut off, turned around, and quietly forgotten by a headquarters that had its hands full with a bigger disaster. They had 1 working radio, 4 hours of ammunition if they were careful, and no orders. What they were about to find under that fire glow would decide whether any of that mattered. Rena had been trying the radio for 20 minutes already, turning the dial through static and silence, hoping for anything with an American accent on the other end of it. Nothing came back but hiss, and once, briefly, a burst of German too fast and too garbled for anyone in the squad to make sense of. The first flare went up at 10 past 4, and for 3 full seconds the whole valley turned white. That was when Dabrowski saw it, and understood with a kind of cold and total certainty that his war had just become very small and very specific. This was no longer about the battalion. This was about a bridge, a clock, and 8 men who did not know yet that the fate of a counterattack the size of an army group had just come down to whether they held their ground for the next 3 hours. He had 8 men left, not the 10 he had started with, and he had 1 radio that would not raise anyone friendly, and he had a bridge he did not yet know was already wired to blow. What he had was enough to start with, and starting was all any of them could afford to think about. By December of 1944, the war in the West had settled, in most American minds, into a grinding, winter kind of routine, a slow push toward the Rhine that seemed only a matter of time. That comfort ended on the 16th, when German armor came out of the Ardennes forest along a 60-mile front, punching through thin American lines in a surprise the size of which the army had not experienced since Pearl Harbor. This was Hitler's last roll of the dice in the West, an all-or-nothing gamble to split the American and British armies, seize the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace before the war machine in the East finished Germany for good. The plan depended on speed, and speed depended on fuel the Wehrmacht did not have enough of to begin with. Every armored spearhead in that offensive was, in effect, running on borrowed gasoline and a ticking clock, which meant every mile of good road, every intact bridge, and every captured fuel dump mattered more than any single battle. At the tip of the northern advance was a battle group of roughly 5,000 men and better than 100 tanks, driving hard for the Meuse River, aiming to reach it before the weather cleared enough for Allied aircraft to catch them in the open. Their route ran straight through Stavelot and across the Ambulve, and beyond that bridge lay open roads, undefended fuel depots the Americans had not had time to destroy, and a straight run to the river that could put the entire German offensive back on schedule. If that spearhead crossed intact and kept its momentum, it would not just win a battle. It would reopen the road to Antwerp and hand Berlin the one thing this attack was built around: time. The Ardennes itself worked against everyone that week, American and German alike. Narrow roads, steep valleys, and a handful of river crossings meant an armored column could not simply spread out and go around an obstacle the way it might on open ground further east. Every bridge, every intact culvert, every stretch of road wide enough for a tank became a choke point that a handful of determined men could contest, at least for a while, and the German planners had known this going in, which was exactly why speed mattered so much to them. They could not afford to stop and fight for every crossing. They needed the crossings to simply be there, undefended, when they arrived. Nobody had told Dabrowski's squad any of this. Not the strategy, not the stakes, not the name of the unit driving toward them. All they had were eyes, ears, and a bridge nobody else was standing on. Whatever happened next, they were what stood between that column and the far bank. Corporal Walt Meeker was the first to move, easing his bar around the corner of the stone abutment. Meeker had a mouth on him that had gotten him docked pay twice since Normandy, a rural Georgia drawl that made even his complaints sound almost cheerful, and a habit of talking through his own fear out loud so nobody else had to sit with theirs in silence. Tonight, for once, he was quiet, and that told Dabrowski more about how bad this was than anything Meeker could have said. It was Meeker who found the wire, just a thin strand running low across the near approach, easy to miss in the dark, easy to trip if a man was tired or scared or both. Dutch Voss came up beside him without a word and traced it with 2 fingers to where it disappeared into a satchel wedged under the first arch. Demolition charges. Somebody, and it was not clear yet whether friend or enemy, had already wired this bridge to blow. That single fact split the squad's problem in 2, and neither half was simple. If German engineers had planted the charges to clear the way for their own crossing, and then blow it behind them, the bridge would go up the moment the column was safely across, denying it to any American counterattack. If American engineers had done the wiring, retreating ahead of the German push, then the bridge was meant to come down before the column ever reached it, and somebody had simply run out of time to finish the job. Either way, 8 tired men now had a piece of a much bigger machine sitting under their boots, primed and unaccounted for, and no way yet to tell which side had left it there. Meeker wanted to cut the wire and be done with it, arguing that a live charge under their own feet was a worse enemy than anything still coming up the road. Dabrowski overruled him without raising his voice, because a wired bridge, if it turned out to be theirs, might be the only weapon this squad had that could actually stop a column of armor, and he was not about to throw it in the river before he knew what it was for. It was the kind of quiet disagreement that would have turned into a real argument on another night, and Meeker let it go the moment Nakamura came back with an answer, the way most arguments in that squad ended, not with someone winning, but with someone else giving them a reason not to keep going. Dabrowski sent PFC George Nakamura forward alone to find out. Nakamura had the steadiest hands in the squad and the least patience for noise, and within 10 minutes he was back, breathing controlled and quiet, with the answer. American wiring. A retreating engineer detachment had rigged the charges 2 nights before and been ordered off the position before they could finish tying in the detonator, chased out by a probing German patrol that nobody upstream had reported. The demolition line ran to a plunger box that was simply gone, carried off or lost in the retreat. The bridge was armed and useless to blow, and useless to defend, unless somebody found a way to finish the job or hold the position by force. It was PVT. Sal Rena, hunched over the one working radio, who delivered the second half of the problem. He had been turning the dial for 20 minutes trying to raise anybody, battalion, regiment, anybody, and what he caught instead was German traffic, close, urgent, and moving. He did not speak the language, but Nakamura's father had run a nursery outside Fresno, and Nakamura had grown up around German seasonal workers before the war, enough to catch fragments. Convoy assembling. Crossing point unguarded. Advance element moving to secure the bridge within the hour. That was the discovery, laid out plain in the cold. An entire spearhead of the German counteroffensive needed this crossing to keep its timetable. The bridge meant to stop them was disarmed by accident, and 8 lost soldiers were the only Americans within miles who knew any of it. Dabrowski did not wait for permission he had no way of getting. He gathered the squad in the ditch below the road and gave it to them straight. No battalion, no orders, no backup coming in time. If that column crossed here, it kept moving, and every American soldier east of the Meuse would be fighting with a German panzer battle group now behind them as well as in front. If they could hold the crossing, force the column to stop, detour, or waste hours finding another way over, they bought time for somebody higher up the chain to figure out what this offensive actually was and where it was actually going. We ain't got a bridge to blow and we ain't got a battalion behind us, Dabrowski said. What we got is us and about 90 minutes. Nobody argued. Earl Whitfield checked his rifle scope by feel in the dark and said nothing, which for Whitfield was as good as a vote. Mickey Doyle, the newest man in the squad and still young enough that his hands shook a little in the cold, asked the only question that mattered. What happens if we can't hold it? Dabrowski didn't answer that one, because there wasn't an answer worth saying out loud, and the silence after it was its own kind of answer. Rena broke the quiet the only way he knew how, offering Doyle the last dry cigarette from a pack he'd been rationing since Brooklyn felt like another country, and telling him that a 19-year-old from Chicago had no business being scared of a bridge when he hadn't even seen the ocean yet. Doyle laughed despite himself, a short, thin sound in the cold, and took the cigarette without lighting it, just to have something to hold onto that wasn't his rifle. They had one road in, one road out, a disarmed bridge, 4 hours of ammunition, and 90 minutes before the column arrived. That was the whole of their war now, and everything after this was the fight to make 90 minutes count. If you'd been standing in that ditch with Dabrowski, knowing there was no order coming and no one would fault you for pulling back, would you have stayed? Hold that question, because by the end of this you may not answer it the way you think you will right now. The first obstacle was the map. Whitfield and Doyle had gone forward to a rise above the road to scout the approach, and it took them only a few minutes to realize the position they'd been told was empty ground on their last resupply map, now had a farmhouse and a stone wall on it that shouldn't exist, built or repaired sometime in the last 2 years, while the map sat in a supply depot going stale. That wall gave any German advance guard a covered firing line straight down onto the bridge approach, and it meant the squad's own plan for where to dig in was wrong before they'd fired a shot. They lost 15 minutes and half their advantage of surprise repositioning around it. The second cost came from the cold. Tommy Callahan, the medic, had been favoring his left hand since first light, and when Dabrowski finally made him show it, 2 fingers had gone white and hard, frostbite starting in earnest. Callahan could still work, but slower, and a medic working slower on a night that was about to get bloody was its own kind of arithmetic nobody wanted to do. The third cost found them before the Germans did. A Belgian farmer, an old man who had refused to leave the burning farmhouse down the valley, stumbled into their position, half frozen and bleeding from a fall on the ice, and there was no way to send him back down a road that might already have German patrols on it, and no way to bring him forward into a fight that was about to start. Callahan stopped the bleeding with his good hand while the old man tried, in broken English and worse French, to tell them something about soldiers on the far side of the river that none of them had time to fully untangle. They left him wrapped and hidden in the lee of the stone wall, one more thing to worry about that none of them had planned for, and one more reason none of them could afford to lose this position, not with a civilian now depending on it too. Then came the patrol. 6 German infantry, moving loose and unhurried up the near bank, clearly not expecting resistance this far from the main column. Whitfield took the point man from 400 yards with a single shot that dropped him without a sound, carrying far enough to warn the others, and Meeker's bar finished it in 8 seconds of controlled fire that used up ammunition they could not replace. It worked, but it cost them a third of Meeker's belt and told any German element behind that patrol, if they were listening, that this crossing was not as undefended as the radio chatter had promised. 40 minutes until the convoy moved, Renna reported, hunched back over the radio, still getting nothing but German traffic and no answer from anyone on the American side. 40 minutes, and the squad still had no way to stop a column of tanks with small arms and 1 demolition man, carrying half a satchel of scavenged charges. Then came a voice from the far bank that none of them expected, calling out in flat, careful English, asking the Americans to lay down their arms, insisting the war in this sector was already decided and further bloodshed served no purpose. For a moment nobody moved, because an English-speaking German officer this far forward, this calm, felt like a trick nobody had a name for yet. Whitfield was the one who broke it, muttering that any officer polite enough to ask twice was buying his own column time to get closer, and he was right. Under cover of the negotiation, a second, smaller patrol had worked its way along the stream bed to the squad's flank, and only Nakamura's insistence on watching the water instead of the voice kept them from being outflanked in the dark. 34 minutes, Renna called, and this time the number came with bad news attached. The one American unit he'd finally managed to raise on a stray frequency. A supply convoy running fuel drums 2 villages back radioed that they had already been diverted off the road by military police clearing a path for what sounded like the very column the squad was trying to stop, which meant no reinforcement was coming from that direction either, and the closest friendly guns were now further away than they had been an hour before. Voss solved that problem the only way left open to him. Without a detonator, without a plunger, he would have to blow the bridge by hand, close enough to trigger the charge with a length of primer cord and a match, which meant somebody had to be standing on the span when it went, and somebody had to get clear in the 4 or 5 seconds after lighting it. 31 minutes, Rena called out. Voss was already moving. The weather turned against them next, a hard sleet starting just as Voss reached the first arch, coating the stone and the wire in a slick glaze that made every handhold treacherous, and every second on that bridge more dangerous than the one before it. Doyle, positioned to cover him, lost his footing on the icy embankment and went down hard enough to wrench his ankle. And now the squad's newest rifle was fighting from a kneeling position with a leg that would not hold his weight if he had to run. Whitfield thought he heard the whole line to keep them there at all had already been asked and answered once tonight. So when Meeker asked, half joking, half not, whether any of them actually expected to walk away from this bridge, Whitfield only checked his scope again and said that walking away wasn't the job, holding was, and the walking could wait until it was over. Nobody laughed this time, but nobody argued either. By now half the squad's original ammunition was gone. Callahan's hand had stopped answering him the way a hand should, and the one detonator that could have made this simple had never existed to begin with. Every option they'd started the night with had narrowed down to Voss, a match, and a length of cord, and every obstacle between here and there had cost them something they were not getting back. If your unit had already lost this much by the time the real fight even started, would you have called it, or pushed the last mile anyway? Keep that in mind, because the next few minutes are where Dabrowski's squad found out which kind of soldiers they actually were. 19 minutes, Rena called, and this time his voice cracked on the number, because underneath it, faint but growing, was the sound they had all been dreading: tracks on gravel. The advance element was coming up the road early, ahead of the convoy's own schedule, sent forward exactly because the earlier patrol had gone silent and somebody on the German side had started asking questions. 2 half-tracks and a scout car came around the bend with headlights taped to slits, moving cautious but moving fast, and the fight that had been building for 90 minutes finally arrived all at once. Whitfield had been a hunter in Kentucky before the army ever found him, and he had a way of going completely still that unnerved men who had known him for years, let alone the ones meeting him for the first time under fire. He did not fire wild, and he did not fire often. He waited for the one shot that mattered and let everything else happen around him until it came. His second shot took the scout car's driver through the taped headlight slit itself, a shot that by any reasonable measure should not have been possible in that light, and at that range, and the car slewed into the ditch. That single shot bought the squad 20 seconds it desperately needed, because the half-tracks behind it had to stop and figure out what they'd just driven into instead of rolling straight past. Nakamura, positioned closest to the wall the bad map had cost them earlier, used that same wall now, the one piece of terrain the enemy had built for their own convenience, and turned it against the dismounting infantry pouring off the half-tracks, holding the choke point at the gap in the stones long enough for Meeker to get the bar back into action from a better angle. Doyle, unable to run on the ankle he'd wrenched on the ice, planted himself against the base of that same wall and kept firing anyway, refusing to fall back when Callahan shouted at him to move, because there was nowhere left to fall back to that mattered. It should have been enough. It was not, because a third vehicle, out of sight until it crested the rise, turned out to be a light tank, and a light tank changed everything the squad had planned for. Voss was still on the bridge. He had spent the whole night moving quietly and carefully, the way a demolitions man learns to move if he wants to keep all his fingers, and there had been no room in that discipline for hurry. Now hurry was the only thing left. He had the primer cord run and the match ready, but the tank's gun was already traversing toward the span, toward the 8 seconds of exposure he needed to finish, and there was no version of this where he lit that fuse and walked away from it in time if that gun fired first. Dabrowski made the call that had been waiting for him since 4 in the morning. He broke cover and ran onto the bridge himself, not to help Voss finish the job, but to draw the tank's gun and its attention away from the one man who could still blow that crossing shut. It nearly wasn't enough. The tank's main gun fired once, missing Dabrowski by a margin that had nothing to do with skill and everything to do with luck, the round taking a chunk out of the parapet instead of the man standing beside it. In the half-second of smoke and stone dust that followed, Voss struck the match. The bridge went up with a sound that swallowed everything else, a column of stone and black water thrown into the sleet, and when it settled, there was a gap in the crossing 40 feet wide where a moment before there had been a road for tanks. For a few seconds, nobody on either bank fired at all, as if the blast itself had used up all the noise the night had left in it. The light tank and the half-tracks behind it had nowhere left to go. The column that had needed this crossing to keep its timetable now had to find another way over, and every mile of detour it was forced to take was a mile it could not afford to lose. Dabrowski was down, caught by fragments from the same round that missed him outright, bleeding badly from the leg, and Callahan worked on him with 2 dead fingers and 1 good hand, while German fire still probed the far bank looking for a way across that no longer existed. It did not take Callahan long to understand there was nothing more skill could do that stubbornness and pressure could not, and he simply kept both hands on the wound and did not stop. They held that position for another 2 hours, past the point when anyone in the squad believed help was coming, until a patrol from the retreating engineer detachment, drawn back by the sound of the blast, finally found them and got word up a chain of command that had spent the whole night guessing where the German advance was actually headed. The battle group that had needed the Stavelot crossing to keep its timetable never made it across the Ambelv on schedule. Forced onto a longer detour through terrain that slowed its armor and burned fuel it could not replace, it lost the hours it needed to reach the Meuse before Allied weather cleared, and when the skies opened 3 days later, Allied aircraft found that column strung out along roads it should never have had to take, and hit it hard enough that it never regained the momentum it started with. The offensive as a whole had been built on the assumption that speed would outrun the Allied response before anyone could organize one, and every crossing that failed to fall on schedule chipped away at that assumption until the whole plan came apart under its own weight. Historians still argue over how many separate delays, at how many separate crossings, added up to stop that spearhead before it reached the river, and no single bridge decides a battle that sighs on its own. But every hour bought at every crossing was an hour the German timetable could not spare, and the Stavelot Bridge was one of the ones that did not hold long enough to help them. What that column would have cost, had it crossed clean and kept its schedule, was not an abstract thing. Fuel depots the Americans had not had time to empty or destroy sat waiting further down that same road, enough to carry the offensive well past the point anyone in December of 1944 believed it could reach. And beyond those depots lay open country, all the way to the river crossings that led toward Antwerp itself. A campaign built to split the American and British armies and force a negotiated peace needed exactly this kind of unbroken run of good luck and open roads. And it got neither, in no small part because of nights like this one, at bridges most people have never heard the name of. Dabrowski's squad received no citation that survives in any record easy to find, no unit decoration with their names attached, because half-lost squads improvising in the chaos of the Bulge rarely got the paperwork that comes with fame. What they got instead was quieter and, in its way, more lasting. Staff officers studying the Ardennes campaign afterward pointed again and again to exactly this kind of action. Small groups of Americans holding crossings and choke points on their own initiative, as the thing that turned a surprise into a delay, and a delay into a defeat. It became a case study taught for years afterward in how thin lines, held by men who refused to move, can cost an enemy more than a division ever could. Voss went home to Iowa the following spring and never spoke about the bridge to anyone outside his own family, though he kept a coil of primer cord in a drawer in his workshop for the rest of his life, never used for anything, just kept. Nakamura returned to a country that had spent the war questioning his loyalty, and spent the rest of his life quietly proving it anyway, running that same nursery outside Fresno his father had built, and rarely mentioning the war to customers who had no idea what he had done in it. Whitfield stayed in the Army another 11 years, training younger riflemen in the same patient, unhurried way he had once waited for a driver's face to appear in a taped headlight slit. Meeker went home to Georgia and ran a hardware store, and for the rest of his life he kept a length of chain by the register that customers assumed was decorative and never asked about. Renna never fully explained to his own family in Brooklyn what it was he had been listening for on that radio, only that some nights he still woke up trying to catch a frequency that had gone quiet 40 years earlier. Doyle's ankle never fully healed, and he walked with a slight limp for the rest of his life, a small daily reminder of a night he was 19 years old and holding a line he had no orders to hold. Callahan lost the 2 frostbitten fingers to the cold that winter, and joked, when anyone asked, that he'd traded them fair for a friend who got to keep his leg. Dabrowski lived. He carried a piece of that parapet in his leg until the day he died, and he used to say the only thing he remembered clearly from those 90 minutes was the sound the water made under the arches before the shooting started, and how quiet it had been for just a moment before everything after. He never called what they did heroic, only necessary, and he was careful, every time he told it, to say that the bridge held because 8 men happened to be standing on it that night, not because any one of them was anything special. It was the kind of modesty that history tends to overlook and quietly depend on all the same. If you had been the one standing on that bank with the fuse in your hand and the tank's gun swinging toward you, would you have run for the far side, or stayed to finish what you started? Tell us what you would have done, and if anyone in your own family carried a story like this one home from that winter, we would be glad to hear it in the comments below. Most of the men who held crossings like this one during that winter never expected anyone to remember the bridge itself, only the cold, and the waiting, and the few minutes when everything came down to whether they stayed or ran. That most of them stayed is the only monument some of these places ever got. This squad is a dramatized composite, representing the kind of small unit action documented across the Ardennes campaign.